Hey everybody, welcome back to Parkitect. Today it's time to tackle Kaiserberg. Now, the description states, oh, hold up, I just need to click on that. The description states that the eccentric owner of this ski slope wants to be prepared for climate change. I didn't remember putting this political message into the game. Interesting, but it's rather unusual. But if you could work with the steep terrain and ignore the cold, this remote location could serve as the site for a unique theme park. All your coasters need to stay close to the ground. Can you use the slopes to your advantage? And then the goals are to get 450 guests into the park, have no loan debts, and have an overall park rating of 75%, which is not going to be too difficult. So the overall idea is that this is a ski resort, which we're not even going to use for skiing anymore. We're just going to turn it into a theme park because the earth is going to warm up too much anyway, which, to be fair, ski resorts are definitely one of the areas where this is most notable. Now, I already have to say, I don't want to fake this too much. I've actually already almost finished this scenario, but I'm going to keep that spoiler for another day. Let's pretend like I'm starting a new file here. It's a bit of a weird recording process that has gone on throughout the making of this video. I've recorded this in Brussels and back home in the Netherlands on my laptop entirely in some different locations, and I'm trying to record this right now at 2 a.m. in the morning before I leave tomorrow morning to go to Austria to go skiing. So that's very topical. So altogether, this video is coming together in a very, very strange sort of set of circumstances. But I'm trying to get this content out, trying to stay on that grind. You know what I mean. Anyway, this is the map. So we have a simple monorail going to the top of this hill. Let's just say mountain, because this is actually quite huge as far as terraforming goes in Parkitect. And that's all we have. So as you can see, quite simple. Now we're not allowed to build above tree height. So I think as soon as I try to build anything too tall, yep, there you go. It's already in the red. So that's going to be quite the challenge. Otherwise, we have some basic flat rides, not too much, and some roller coasters that are actually going to be quite a challenge to make profitable. So not the easiest park, definitely. But then again, the goals for the park are pretty easy. So altogether, I think it's quite doable. And let's see how I did. Alright, so I had one basic idea for this whole build, and that was to make this park look like a village that you commonly find at the valley of a ski resort, mostly actually like the ones that you find in the US. So an architectural style that's very much inspired by European alpine architecture, but at the same time at a much larger scale, with large-scale hotel buildings and resorts and things like this. And obviously I won't really be building hotels exactly or anything like this, but it's kind of inspired by the same kind of architecture. Imagine something like Whistler, or actually, yeah, something like Whistler. That could work out very well. So honestly, for my inspiration this time around, I just went to Google Images and looked up a bunch of big ski resorts, and then specifically their sort of town centers and what these look like. And while I'm not really drawing inspiration from anything in particular, it's just this overall style that I'm gonna try to emulate with this build. And I think it's pretty useful for a number of reasons. Of course, this whole scenario is shaped like a ski resort, so I think thematically, of course, it just makes most sense. But also, given the restrictions of the scenario, the fact that I'm not allowed to build above tree heights, which is going to make it very difficult to rely on roller coasters, and the roller coasters that I do build are going to have to hug the slopes, if you will. And I'm saying quote-unquote slopes, I should say, actually, because they're not really slopes, but there are some open areas between the forest on the hill that I'm planning to build my roller coasters on. But beside from that, I can't really build any big rides anywhere, so I really want to focus on buildings and creating this village-like atmosphere, and then just putting the roller coasters somewhere else up the hill, and hopefully that'll work. And it's also quite difficult to focus on flat rides because we don't get a lot of flat rides on the scenario. I don't know, for some reason this scenario just throws a bunch of different challenges on you, and one of them is the fact that you really have to research quite a lot if you want to get some decent flat rides. So I'm also not starting out with too much in that department, so while I'm building these buildings, I'm definitely going to research flat rides and get to that in the near future as well. I'm starting off though with the tourbillon, because that is always such a good earner, and even when I end up building lots of different rides throughout the park, I think this ride ends up being the most lucrative one. Definitely over the course of the whole scenario playthrough, but altogether this thing always nets a few $100s per month. It's very, very good. Honestly, one of the best flat rides that you can build from a gameplay perspective, and also just to look at. Sometimes I just end up playing the game without actually building something. I just look at that thing going around. It's so interesting. I just love that. Sorry, it's late. I guess my voice is gonna start to crack a little bit. Anyway, if you're interested in it, in real life the Tourbillon is made by ABC Rides. I'm not sure if it's also called that in real life, but it's definitely a real ride, and you can find it, I believe, in China or Hong Kong, one of the two, although of course the distinction is a bit difficult there. But it's also in Six Flags nowadays. But from what I've heard, it's much more interesting to look at than to actually ride. It's just one of the coolest flat rides as far as the overall design goes, I think. Anyway, so the buildings that I've built so far are just these big resort-like alpine structures, and to sort of fit the station that was already in the map a little bit in with these buildings, I decided to add some extra framework on that as well. Honestly, throughout this whole build, I'm mostly just going to focus on building stucco walls with wooden timber work, so it's very similar to what I've been doing in the last episode as well. Not really too different, everything's on a slightly larger scale and there's a bit more detail, and I'm just experimenting in a few different ways, but it's very similar at the end of the day, so nothing too spectacular. Definitely something that I've done in Parkitect quite a few times already. So I'm trying to find as much variation as I can here, but I also have to admit, to some extent I've done a lot of this stuff before, and the really only difference between the Alpine builds that I've done in earlier scenarios is just that the setting is completely different, but that aside, I'm using a lot of the same pieces and colors and things like this. And especially for the wooden pieces, many of the buildings end up having very similar colors, so I'm a bit afraid of making everything look drab, so I do try to have slight variation, slightly different shades of brown and things like that for every building, just to have some differences, but at the end of the day, everything is going to be a bit similar, so definitely not the most interesting build in that sense. Why am I always just, I don't know, complaining about my own builds? I do really like this scenario, actually. The way that it turns out in the end, even if it is quite derivative, it's very coherent, and I kind of feel like what I was going for wasn't too original, but for what it is, it worked out quite well, and I'm honestly very happy with it. Especially the layout, focusing on this one square with this big flat ride in the middle. I think it works out very well. It would realistically also work for a ski village in real life, so it's something that I think fits the theme. But at the same time, it just puts this one major attraction of the park on display. And I'm not even going to kid about this. Honestly, this is going to be the flagship ride of the park, because even though I'm gonna build some roller coasters later on, you'll probably find that these roller coasters aren't all that special, and definitely aren't going to make the thrill seekers happy. So this is kind of, you know, for the people who are really into theme parks, this is probably the most exciting thing that's even in this park anyway. So yeah, ride-wise, it's not gonna be too great. It's really focused on scenery. Now, I filled in two sides of this big square with just big, wide buildings, and for this last side I wanted to build by far the biggest building of this whole complex, and so I'm even raising it up a little bit. I was thinking about using terraforming here, but as the scenario is, we're not allowed to use terraforming, which makes sense, because if we were, that could have just been used to, you know, raise the terrain and get over the tree height restriction, so it's quite good that we are restricted in that sense, but sometimes there's just these little things that I would love to use some terraforming for, just for decorative purposes. So in this case, I'm just using a lot of pathworks to make it seem like there is a hill, and like I adjusted this area with some terraforming, but it's not quite there yet. Anyway, that is going to be the space for a later building, which is going to be the biggest building in this whole section. But first I just wanted to work out what the general layout of this area would be, so I had an idea of, you know, what this building would be shaped like, how I would put this whole thing together. So right in front of the slopes, the quote-unquote slopes of this map, I ended up putting some bumper cars, which I'm not sure how much I like the placement there. It does kind of close off the slopes from this village here, which thematically doesn't really make the most sense, but at the end of the day, I couldn't really find a great way to combine the slopes on the hill and the actual village, because at the end of the day, it's not an actual ski resort, and you won't see the kind of infrastructure that connects a town with the mountain that you'll find in ski resorts. So honestly, I just figured it would be okay to put these bumper cars here and put some paths in later to connect into that area. And then right in front of that are some more foliage-based elements, a little bit of gardening. I really wasn't too sure what to do with that section, so I figured just putting in some filler trees and rockwork and shrubbery would pretty much do the trick. It also helps to, provide some greenery in between the buildings, because foliage just always makes things look better. I think that's honestly a pretty easy statement to make, and one that I've definitely already made way too many times in videos. I'm also keeping the bumper cars a bit simple, but I do want to theme the queue because it helps bring some extra architecture into this area, helps close off the square a little bit more and make it really feel like a village. So even though this is not going to be too intricate, very similar to the buildings that I've built so far, it's something that I think really helps out a lot. And given the fact that I'm not putting a roof over the bumper cars itself, because, well, it already has a roof and it's kind of difficult to reappropriate that and turn it into something else, I always think that, putting some sort of building next to or around the bumper cars is the next best solution. It would actually kind of be cool to be able to turn off that roof, I just realized. I mean, at the end of the day, you do often find bumper cars in real life with completely different roof structures, so having that sort of, that possibility to mess around with the theming yourself would actually be really cool. But then again, I think this roof could easily be covered if you really wanted to do so and really put some effort into it. But yeah, it's honestly just a thought that I had for a second, because I think about real life bumper cars, I know that Roller Coaster Tycoon has always featured bumper cars with glass roofs, but from my experience, usually they don't, especially because the roof has to be used for the electricity that the bumper cars use. Either way, that's a little bit off topic. In this building, on the other side, I decided to put in 2 flat rides, 2 motion simulators. Very lame, I know. I just thought I need some rides to earn some money as well, and at this point I was quickly running out of money, so if I didn't put like 2 flat rides in at the same time, I wasn't sure if I was ever gonna make a profit on this park. And at the end of the day, profit is definitely the most important thing if I want to keep this scenario alive, lest I be building all of the scenery for nothing, so ended up just putting 2 motion simulators there. I don't think it really matters too much, because I will eventually just build a building over it, but it is a bit lame, I agree. Normally I like to stick to the rule to not copy any rides over into the same park, because it's a bit boring, but in this case I really didn't see another way out of it. Besides, I really wanted to build a lot of buildings but not have a lot of flat rides in the open air, so I had to make some concessions somewhere, and this is the building where it fit the best, I think, given that this building is going to be large enough to house 2 flat rides, including 2 queue lines, so hey, it's just the thing that kind of works best. Now for this one, before I went into the full detailing, I just ended up adding these pillars all around it to create the shape and already have that detailing out of the way. And only after that adding the roofs and the walls, which kind of helps actually to get the pillars in the right position. Usually I always get annoyed when I have to rotate all around the building to add the details everywhere. Which isn't too bad from a gameplay perspective, but I have to say I'm always very sort of conscious of my recording, so I try not to move the camera around too much, and definitely don't want to zoom or rotate too much, because this could be really disorienting on a time-lapse. And with buildings where you want to add details on all sides, this can definitely be a bit of a challenge, because I do want to do as much as possible without moving the camera as much. So sometimes putting in pillars and details before putting in the walls and stuff works out, because you can at least see through them and you don't have to rotate all around the building. Also, there's the idea that building the structure of the building before you build the actual scenery is often quite useful to make it look a bit better and to sort of help you guide along where the woodwork should be. But that's something for the ski resort episode of Planet Coaster that I definitely shouldn't spoil in this video. So yeah, altogether, as you can see, this building is shaping out to be quite similar to the building on the other side, with some large overhanging roofs with gables, with some balconies underneath them. It's always quite difficult to fit in buildings on the full grid in Parkitect because you can't deviate from it, but at the same time, I always want to have some overhanging roofs, so I find that these sort of gables that stick out are a really good solution to creating the illusion of having overhanging roofs and large eaves all around the building, when in reality everything's completely on the grid. And besides that, I ended up adding a spire right in the middle of the building because I just can't do without my spires. So yeah, I had to add that. Now finally, I'm moving on to the first roller coaster of this build. And it might honestly just be the most intense roller coaster. I think in terms of stats, it actually is. It's a simple junior coaster that does a quick lift hill and just kind of meanders around this slope here. And yeah, finds its way back into the station. It's nothing too particularly exciting, but it's a lot more unique than most junior coasters that I've made throughout this series, so that's an improvement, I suppose, although that just kind of comes with the territory of working on this map where you have to build below tree height, and I just have to make use of the terraforming, which is always fun. I actually had a lot of fun creating this layout and trying to figure out where exactly it could go, because it is quite a challenge to make this work. So I actually spent a lot of time on this layout as well. I'm not sure if this was the full height that I ended up going with in the end. I think at some point I might have raised the lift hill a little bit and tried to go into another direction, because I kind of got stuck at the location where I am right now. So as you can see, just have a turn swooping down from the lift hill after a small pre-drop into these two helixes, and then after that coming back down to the ground. But I really struggled when it comes to getting back to the station from this position. So what I ended up doing here is keeping this layout more or less the same, but just trying to have this awkward brake run that sits next to the station but sort of goes parallel to it, and getting to that point just took a lot of trial and error to get like my location right. So when it comes to roller coasters like this, I personally find that working on it a bit longer just always works out, because I don't know, I don't want to be stuck with a layout that I don't really like, and roller coasters are, at the end of the day, I think still my favorite thing to build in Parkitect. Just with that simple piece-by-piece system that is so reminiscent of Roller Coaster Tycoon, yet at the same time so much more flexible and realistic. For me, it just hits the balance between realism and the sort of cartoony gameplay style coaster builder just right. And it might still just be my favorite thing about this game. Anyhow, I ended up finishing the layout just like that, with a simple helix at the end and a station flyby, although I'm not sure if it's called a station flyby if you're flying underneath the station. Usually, I guess a flyby would be if you're going above the station, but we're going through the station building regardless, so I know the excitement points don't really work like that in this game, but I feel like in real life, they do work in a sense that going through a station always just makes a roller coaster so much cooler. All of the great coasters, international wooden coasters that fly through their station, it's just great. Also Tornado in Finland, the Intamin inverted coaster, which does a barrel roll through the station, super awesome. But I have to give a special shout out to Lech coaster in Legendia in Poland, which is just one of the best coasters in the world. Kind of underrated, I guess, amongst the general public, perhaps a bit overrated among coaster enthusiasts who just like to praise it, because it's kind of the story of the underdog Vekoma finally getting good. But Lech coaster does this amazing corkscrew / zero G roll style elements through the station, and the station building has even been designed to have these gables on the side which the coaster flies through, and it's just really cool. It's such a cool coaster. For anyone who's not familiar with Lech coaster but interested in roller coasters, I highly recommend checking it out. It's just spelled Lech, because it's a really cool beast. And even though it's small and it doesn't look like that much, it's very intense. Personally, I had a grey out every single time at the bottom of the first drop. So that's quite something. I think that's the only coaster that I consistently grey out on, so I'm not sure quite like how much positive G-force it hits and for what period of time, but it's definitely one of the most intense coasters in terms of positive G-forces, if I'm allowed to trust my judgment based on graying out every single time. I love it. I might actually go back there this summer. Anyway, I'm getting very off topic at the moment. Basically, I've been building the station, which was a quite interesting affair because it's very tall, because the station building itself is very tall, but then I also ended up adding another floor on top of the track there. But also, underneath the station, we also have the station flyby going underneath, which I'm not sure what to call exactly. But we also have the queue line and the entrance path, so there's a lot to fit in underneath all of that. So it's quite a tall building with a bunch of different layers, but at the end of the day, I also think that kind of makes it very interesting. So I'm pretty happy with the station, because even though it's very simple in terms of the pieces that I used, it does have a lot of interesting interaction between the different elements of pathwork and coaster track. Now, moving on from here, I did a bit of research in the meantime and ended up getting this the spinny boy. So I figured might as well turn this into a new flat ride, because I really need those guests at the end of the day. I've been saying that too much this video. Anyway, because at the end of the day, I don't have a lot of rides in this park yet, and it's mostly scenery, so I just had to add this thing in here. And now you might be wondering why there's suddenly a go-kart track in the park, and I have to admit, I actually did record that section, and it was quite cool actually, making the go-kart layout, especially because it's something that I haven't done that much. I think the Orchard Acres scenario was the only one where I actually used the go-kart track. But yeah, it was actually a fun time-lapse, but unfortunately, when I was recording it, for some reason, my idiot face decided to record in 60 FPS time-lapse. So I filled the whole hard drive of my laptop with that recording file, and I had to remove it in the end to make space for the rest of the recording of this episode. So to give a very, very quick summary, I was just basically making a go-kart track. It's not too special, it doesn't have any special elements or anything, and a pretty simple station, but I think it rounds up the park quite well. And down there we also have a viewing area where people can look at the people who are racing, which I think in Parkitect as a game people don't really do per se, but for the layout of this park I think it makes some sense. And you also have the rooms of the quote-unquote hotel with the observation, with the simulation rides inside of it as well. So altogether I think it's a pretty cool scene. I did add some extra scenery to it at this point. But yeah, basically the majority of this I wasn't able to feature in this video because I just had to make some space. Next time I'm definitely gonna try to remember to not have my Bandicam set to 60 FPS anymore, because that was not the greatest thing I could do in that sense. Also, I've been very, I don't know, not too awake throughout the recording of this whole thing, but I have to be very honest, I'm going to Austria tomorrow, so I needed to finish this recording and get this out here, so it's kind of late, and I'm kind of falling asleep, but I'm also pushing myself to put this thing out here, so it's not really quite the quality of commentary either that I would normally like to go for. But I gotta provide that content, and I want to get this out also because it's super thematically appropriate, because by the time that this video comes out, I will be in Austria. I don't know exactly what the day will be. That all just kind of depends on what I decide to do with it. But yeah, this is actually very thematic, because not only is this a ski resort based map, but it's specifically based on ski resorts that I will most likely go to, and when this video comes out, may actually be at specifically. And this is an interesting background that I can't believe I'm only now just saying. This is based on Elmau, which is part of the same area as, well, Westendorf, Schäffau. It's a giant skiing area near Kitzbühel in Austria. And before a few years ago, they used to have a rail line, a funicular, going up to the top of the mountain. And that is what the monorail in this park is basically inspired by, because I wanted to build a scenario that would resemble a ski resort, but of course Parkitect doesn't have gondolas or chairlifts, so I figured A monorail might just be the next best thing, because sometimes you find these kinds of funiculars in real-life ski resorts as well. They are quite an old thing, so they are slowly being phased out. So in Elma, for instance, it was replaced by a 10-person gondola by Doppelmayr a few years ago, but it's a cool thing nonetheless. And to get back on track for a little bit, I decided to add my second coaster, which is the Alpine coaster. After the horrible disaster of Hickory Hill in the last episode that you guys fortunately, well, or unfortunately, didn't get to see beyond a quick screenshot, I decided to add a alpine coaster to this park, because at this point I was already making enough profit and I couldn't really, care too much if this alpine coaster wasn't going to run a profit. Besides, I needed to get more guests into the park, because that was my main challenge at this point. And even if this thing isn't very efficient at, bringing in the money, I do hope that it's very good at bringing in people into the park, and eventually it will definitely prove that it does just that. So for this scenario, actually, I think it was a very good decision to add this ride, because if this ride is going to thematically work in any scenario, it's definitely Kaiserberg. In real life, you can find these on many a mountain in Europe, throughout Austria and Germany specifically. I know there are lots of them. Personally, I've been on a few of them as well, one in Fieberbrunn in Austria, and also a bunch of them in the Black Forest in Germany. I really love these things, although to be honest, they are a bit less interesting, I find, than a typical bobsled, old like Sommerrodobahn, as they say in Germany. But yeah, they're really cool. I really like them. And something that I thought is super funny. I don't know if I'll be able to see this during the real-time section at the end of this video checking out the park, but something that I thought was super funny is actually that you get these people in the game who just break the whole way down on these things and end up, slowing people behind them down as well, which is totally something that happens in real life. And like, my only nuisance with these coasters is that every now and then you get these people who have a major difference in how fast they want to go, and it's totally fine if you prefer to go slow. That's the fun part of these kinds of coasters. Everybody has their own brake pedal, and you can always make it as slow or fast as you want it to be. But it's kind of annoying if you want to go down with no brakes and the person in front of you is of the much slower sort of preference. So it's something that happened to me quite a few times, and it's really fun to see it happen in the game as well. I will say though, in general, people go down this thing super slowly. I did test this ride, and on my test runs it went down pretty speedy. But then again, when it's testing, it doesn't do any brakes, and as soon as people start riding it, they do slow down significantly, which, funnily enough, isn't very realistic, I guess, because without somebody actively holding down the brake, you automatically start braking. So I don't think you could even test these without a person in them, unless there's some sort of system to, remove this effect on the brake. Because the great thing is that you always have to actively, not brake, and as soon as you let go, the thing just starts slowing down. So that's kind of cool how they work. They're really good fun, and anyone who hasn't been on one of these things, I greatly recommend checking one of them out if you ever have a chance. They're honestly not even as scary as they seem at first. I know they aren't too particularly scary to the average coaster enthusiast, but they're really just quite slow and much less intense than they even look, so I think they're cool. It does all just depend on what the layout of the one that you're riding is like though, because some of them have some really steep sections and some of them are just kind of slow and meandering. Now the final thing, the final ride that I decided to add into this park, actually no, this is not the final ride, this is the second to final ride, is this spinny boy here, which is always a good one because it draws in a lot of crowds. At this point I was really just trying to get in a bunch of final flat rides. The majority of the most important scenery was already in here. I just needed to get more people to actually visit the park so that I could meet the objectives. So this is another attempt to bring the guests what they want, more thrill rides, but otherwise I'm keeping it quite simple. I do want to experiment a bit more with color schemes though, because I've noticed that on many flat rides so far, I tend to be a bit safe and simple when it comes to the color schemes, which is kind of a shame because there's a lot to be experimented with. So for this one, I ended up picking a sort of dark green and light yellowish green color combination, which I think works out alright with the foliage in this map. And then finally, here's an orbiter with a dark sort of purple color scheme eventually. Not too exciting, but then again, there's not too much that you can really change about the colors of this thing. But this is actually the right that ends up not completely being necessary because I was already reaching the cause of this scenario. But it's a good way to finish up this part of the park and basically make it so that there are no dead ends anymore. That's basically something that I wanted to try. And yeah, honestly, it feels like the park is not too crammed at this point, but it definitely feels like there was no more space for me to add anything significant. So it feels like just the right time to end this scenario, both from a gameplay perspective and also from a whole design of the park perspective. So without further ado, let's take a look at how the park is doing. Alright, so unfortunately it's raining, so it's not really the greatest set of circumstances to win this scenario in, but there you go, I've completed all goals and it's basically all finished. Now, if the weather can be a little bit better, I would love to show off this park a little bit more. Okay, I'm just gonna fast forward. Alright, so after that unfortunate combination of rain and confetti, it's finally time to take a good look at the park. So here we have the station for the roller coaster. Not quite sure why I'm doing this not entirely chronologically. A bit of a Tarantino-esque walkthrough of the park, I suppose. But yeah, here's the roller coaster. As you can see, it's quite simple, but I do like this layered sense of the station with different paths and tracks all kind of mingling together and forming this interesting complex whole. Let's do a quick POV of this coaster. It's actually quite smooth. As far as junior coasters go, I know I keep coming back to it. I've built so many of these throughout this whole campaign playthrough, but this is definitely one of my favorites, as far as the layout goes anyway. So a bunch of curves that sort of sweep up and down. One big drop in the middle of the layout here before we start curving back up. And then we turn around the station, fly through it there, come over to this helix, bit of path interaction here, and into the brakes, which also serve as the block brakes, which make sure that this coaster has a decent, capacity, I should say, but then again, it's something that apparently I don't really need because I rarely actually fill all of the trains. This thing is actually an efficiency monster in a sense. A ride that's not very efficient is the Alpine coaster here, and I barely even see anybody riding it right now. Oh, there we go. Somebody. I really hope this person doesn't want to brake too much, because I do prefer this thing to be a bit speedier. Yeah, never mind. There we go. Is this a he or a okay, that's definitely a he. Wait, is it though? I don't know. This person, whatever their gender is definitely a bit of the slow type when it comes to alpine coasters. It's too bad that there aren't that many people on the ride right now, because it's actually interesting to see how it sometimes slows down as soon as one person goes down very slowly. I imagine this person might actually catch up at some point in the future, but probably not. But as you can see, just slowly making our way down. This is actually a really cool jump that you could catch some airtime on if you're one of these daredevils that goes down these things with no brakes, I think. Yeah, no, they are both kind of pussies, let's be honest. Something that I also didn't really talk about, but which makes sense, I think, for this type of coaster, is that the lift hill has these 3 different sections where it curves upwards, because in real life they will have a cable lift, but it's not always attached to the track for the whole duration of the lift hill. So they have these upward curves to make sure that the cable stays on the track and underneath the cart, and you'll often see it, fly through the sky in front of your cart as well. So I know it looks a bit strange, but this is actually what the lift hills of alpine coasters in real life are shaped like as well. They're really an interesting coaster type, and definitely a lot of fun. Anyway, moving to some of the scenery. Here is the general scene of the town, the big main square with the crazy tourbillon in the middle of it. Call it a hyperspace cube or whatever else I don't know what's another good English name, but anyway, it's a really cool flat ride, love it, and it's a cool centerpiece for the town, I think. With here the big building with the simulators in it, which I'm not actually sure if anybody even rides those. Yeah, maybe not, but it definitely helped attract the necessary amount of guests into the park, so that was good. And this very thick tower as well. I never really make my towers this fat, if you will, but I think it works out with the thatch work and the overall roof structure. Altogether, it doesn't seem too strange. And then we have the top spin here, sort of finishing off this section of the park. Of course, the bumper cars here. Very interesting building, actually, that I didn't talk much about for the Gravitron, which the Gravitron also kind of reminds me of these old marshmallow candies with that sort of red swirl and white swirl here. But yeah, it's a pretty interesting sort of structure for a flat ride building that I haven't really tried before, but I'd love to try something similar again in the near future because it worked out better than I expected. And then here are the go-karts, which I didn't really showcase too much, but as you can see, it uses a very simple gable roof with the gable sticking out on different directions here. And then the track itself just contains a bunch of S-bends and curves here and there. It's really quite simple as far as go-karts are concerned. It's mostly benefits from the scenery around it, having lots of trees and rock work and some basic deco items to help make it a bit more interesting. And of course a viewing platform over here as well. And it's already raining again. Great. And then here's the the token flat ride that I forget to open before I run the park. Great. That's something I just can't help but do, no matter which scenario I'm playing, apparently. Anyway, that is just about it for this park, so I'm gonna leave it at that and quit this game and see what the next park is that I'm gonna get with this, because honestly, I actually don't know the order of the scenarios at this point. Okay, so for Kaiserberg, we're getting the big communications tower that's on top of the mountain. And moving into this valley over here, what's that gonna be? Silica slopes, oh boy. That's gonna be a good time. Okay, great. I'm not sure if everybody knows what Silica slopes is all about, but this is, honestly, one of my favorite scenarios, if not my favorite, out of the ones that I worked on. It's very reminiscent and very inspired, actually, by a particular Roller Coaster Tycoon 1 scenario, but I will talk more about that when the time comes. For next time, I might actually try to tackle Sakura Gardens instead. I'm not entirely sure. It could be either one of these two. Anyhow, thank you guys for watching, and I hope to see you in the next episode. Bye guys!